In March of this year, the Physicians for Social Responsibility released a report on the casualty rates from the war on terror in the countries of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan since 2003. Their conservative estimate is that 1.3 million may have died in Iraq as a result of war. But the figure could be as high as 2 million. Adding in the deaths in Afghanistan and Pakistan, that figure could reach as high as 4 million Muslims killed. A recent article by journalist Kit O'Connell appearing on mintpressnews.com about these staggering numbers of Muslim casualties posed the question, should we call this genocide? Earlier, we talked with the founder of Mint Press News, Mnar Muhawesh, about the physician's report and the question posed by O'Connell. We started off by asking her, why don't we hear about these numbers from the mainstream media?
Well, this report actually came out in April of this year, and it was barely even mentioned by the corporate press or the mainstream media. In fact, only a couple of independent media outlets like Mint Press covered it. And the problem with these numbers is that there really is no way to really know the exact number of the death toll from the U.S. war, Western wars in the Middle East. Part of the problem is that government agencies who have been responsible and have been appointed to keep track of these numbers are either keeping these numbers classified, or the numbers that they're providing are just logically too low. And you mentioned the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the U.S. military action in Pakistan as well. But if we actually break down the numbers, we first originally thought that the war in Iraq, this recent one, resulted in about 1 million deaths, but that number could actually be as high as 2 million. In addition to this, the U.S.-led war on terror, the biggest misconception about that is that it actually started after 9/11. Both the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan are actually continuations and an extension of U.S. military action from the 1990s. And if we break down the numbers even further, in the 1990s, the U.S. war in Iraq under the first Gulf War resulted in over 200,000 Iraqi deaths. But shortly after that, the U.S. Sanctioned Iraq with some of the most brutal sanctions that we have known in history, blocking everyday necessities from entering the country, which actually resulted from that indirect action to nearly 2 million Iraqi deaths. And of course, the majority of these are Muslims. And half of those deaths from those sanctions were actually children. At the same time, the U.S. was involved in covertly arming and funding the Taliban in Afghanistan as well. And during that time, the strategy was divide and conquer and to wreak havoc across Afghanistan to basically justify the second invasion of Afghanistan after 9/11. And during that time, the numbers are actually estimated to be about 2 million in Afghanistan. So both direct and indirect warfare by the United States and its allies in this war on terror has resulted in actually a total of about 6 million to possibly 8 million Muslim deaths since 1990.
Those are incredible numbers, when you just hear them. One thing that's interesting, too, is the methodologies that are used for counting the dead, and they were criticized in this report. The study was highly critical of something called the Iraq body count, which estimated about 110,000 deaths in Iraq. The IBC also wildly underreported the deaths from airstrikes, only reported 3 out of 125 in just the year 2005. The study was also critical of the methodologies of other studies for excluding key regions and evidence. Why doesn't the U.S. and the U.K. count civilian casualties in situations like this? Why are these numbers so low when, in general, reliable figures are hard to come by?
Well, keeping track of death tolls from our wars is really an inconvenience to those who are waging these wars. And the last thing that these nations want to do is to make available these numbers to the general public. I mean, just imagine if people were to hear that these wars for the past, 20, almost 30 years have resulted in nearly 8 million deaths of Muslims when, these wars have been sold to us that we're fighting an enemy, but in reality, 8 million civilians could have possibly been killed. Not many people would jump on board and say that they support this war, any war for that matter, and calls for classifying these wars as genocide and investigation into human rights crimes and, all of those things would take place. So this war is being sold to us as a war fighting an evil-doing people. It's a crusade. It's a religious fight. And so that's easier for people to jump on board. But when we say that, this war is for oil and we're killing nearly 8 million people for the sake of controlling the Middle Eastern oil reserves, then people are easily manipulated and are able to jump on board to support that.
It's interesting. Very interesting.
The problem seems to go deeper and goes back into what we were talking about earlier, sanctions against Iraq and, during the Gulf War. Why are Americans so in the dark about the root causes of violence in the Middle East? And, does the media play a role? Because if we count all of the wars in the Middle East, the sanctions, even events going back to the 70s and 80s with the U.S. support for the Taliban, the Mujahideen against the Soviets, the figures, like you said, could reach 6 to 8 million. So, how does the media, or what's the root cause for us being so misinformed about this information and those conflicts?
Right. Well, there's no question that the media has been in bed with the establishment, with the oligarchy, with those who are waging these wars. But every empire throughout history has had to create some sort of boogeyman to justify Orwellian laws that intrude on people's individual rights as citizens, as well as to justify war. And in the United States, we have a war-driven economy, and this has been taking place since, for the past 40 years. And with the United States, it's engaged in over 134 acts of war in predominantly Muslim nations across the Middle East, Africa. Muslims and Islam have become the victim of the demonization by our politicians and media to justify this war. And don't get me wrong, if it was any other religious group like Hindus or Buddhists or Jewish people, the same kind of dehumanization would have occurred. So the word terrorism has been marketed and sold to the public as being a Muslim thing that we need to fight, when in reality, the majority of those killed by radical Islam and war itself, which is a form of terrorism, are Muslims. And so at the end of the day, we have to be honest, though, and even I will say this, is that these wars are really not about Islam or Muslims or terrorism per se. All of these wars are about profit to feed the military-industrial complex and to control resources. The only reason the word crusade was uttered by George W. Bush when he waged the war on terror, again, was to build his support, his conservative support from his Christian base who see Islam as a threat to their livelihood.
Right, and it's so true. I was going to just mention that George Bush, it was "we are on a crusade." He used the Crusades, which is historically was Christians going to the Middle East and either trying to convert or conquer Muslim nations and crush, the religion of Islam. So it was a really strange and unsettling thing to hear our president say that, and I think that we've kind of got stuck in that, and that just made it easy for people to sort of explain away what was going on.
It's interesting because when you talk about these numbers and the size of these numbers, the word, in articles I've read and things like that, they're starting, and you mentioned earlier, they're starting to use the word genocide. And, referring to this loss of life as, acts of genocide, which is a pretty powerful word to throw around. Mnar, do you believe that that's the correct term for what's going on? I mean, can we actually call this an issue of genocide?
I think the simple answer is yes, that this is a genocide, but even to come to that conclusion, it is actually a trickier process than meets the eye because of the legal definitions of genocide. The crime of genocide is actually defined by international law, and that is that you have to prove that there's an actual intent to destroy wholeheartedly a religious group or an ethnic group. And so while the United States doesn't have any written rule of law that their intent is to destroy Islam or Muslims or Arabs for that matter, like the Nazis did, who had their intent written down, and it was part of their rule of law that they wanted to exterminate Jews, or how Israel right now has part of their rule of law to ethnically cleanse Palestinians. I mean, they have it very blatantly written out. The U.S. doesn't have it written out like that. When George Bush said, we're fighting a crusade, we're launching a crusade against an evil-doing people, he was very careful to make sure that it was against terrorism, so it had like a good cause behind it, that we're saving these people. And when you ask me that question, what comes to mind is the problem is that to classify these wars as genocide, we have to assume that there's going to be some sort of accountability and some sort of international criminal court to bring justice to humanity. But unfortunately, the very institutions that should be doing this, like the media, like the International Criminal Court, that should be calling out these crimes for what they are held financially hostage by the same nations that commit these crimes.
Wow. So terrifying. Thank you so much for coming on today and helping break this down for us a little bit. Mnar Muhawesh from Mint Press News, founder of Mint Press News. Check it out. Thank you so much for coming on today.